Arcane is just not a show, it's a game changer for animation. Its stunning art style and storytelling redefine what animation could be. As an artist, I was initially captivated by the world it created, but mostly by the art style. So in this video, we're going to be exploring Arcane's unique art style, and I walk you through my entire process of recreating Jinx in Unreal Engine, from the initial sculpt in ZBrush to the final render in Unreal. Let's dive into the art of Arcane. Alright, let's jump into ZBrush, starting with a simple sphere. I use him Andrew Loomis method, that is a classic for drawing heads in 2D that also works great in 3D. This approach helps me to block out the basic forms and proportions before diving into details. But before starting, if you're interested to learning more about my workflow and you're ready to take your next step into your character art career, consider the Art Heroes Character Accelerator program. In 16 weeks, we provide you comprehensive training that takes you from the beginner to a professional, regardless of your starting level. You join a community of artists just like you and get mentored by industry professionals already working on the industry. Build your best portfolio and start your career now with Art Heroes. For this project, I will be using as a reference the artwork from Thibaut Granet. It was very useful since he created the Jinx model on Arcane, and you can find the breakdown on ArtStation. Watching closely, what I noticed is how the characters were defined by such angular angles and hard edges. Overall, the silhouette or any element that contrasts, including textures, they were very strong, like the ears, the eyebrows, the upper lid, or even the nose bridge area. There are some exceptions on the lower eyelid or the lower lip, among others, so we're going to be playing a lot with that. Analyzing the profile view and following the Andrew Loomis method, I noticed the ear has some offset from what normally the origin will be. That's due to the stylization. From there, I will follow the same angular shapes and will make sure to break the silhouette enough with the hair later on in ZBrush. Alright, so let's start in ZBrush. I will start with a sphere using the Andrew Loomis method, so the process is very simple. I will clip the sphere from both sides, and from there I will start adjusting the volumes to get an initial shape that will resemble the reference. Once I'm happy with the head area, I will start extracting the other head elements that play a major role on the silhouette, like ears for example. And it's very important that I keep everything very low and subdivided at this stage. I don't really care if the character is going to look like Jinx, but mostly I want to make sure that anatomy and landmarks are considered. For the body area, these major shapes that are going to be created are going to be initialized from standard primitives like spheres or cylinders. This way it's going to be easier to find the original shape and also adjust the silhouette to the Jinx reference I got. I normally start all my characters with the same method since it makes the hard work easier. If you want to know more on this process in depth, you can check this other video. Once I'm happy with the initial primitive blockout, I'm going to merge everything together and start adjusting the silhouette to get a more relaxed pose. For the next part of the process, I will subdivide the model and will define the shapes better. Right now, I'm going for the likeness, and will pay closer attention to secondary details, like the eye shapes, nose, and lips. What I enjoy about this moment is that it's way more artistic, and I get to enjoy it way more. Something that I noticed, especially on the ears, is that they are quite angular comparing to other areas of this character. Once I finish, I merge all the body into a single mesh. The original idea is to later on extract cloth pieces from it, since most of the garments are tied to the body. So working with a single mesh makes it easier. You guys need to remember that sometimes a good process can make the work easier, so it's good to do all your preparation work in advance and plan the characters correctly. Something that defines the Arcane style is that a lot of details not necessarily come from the sculpt, but from the texture. So I found myself fighting during the sculpt process and thinking if it worth sculpting some areas or not. Eventually, I decided to keep some major details on the sculpt, especially the folds, since my sculpting skills are better than my texturing skills, and I had some concerns if I could pull off the textures correctly later on. So on the clothes, I will be extracting all the clothes from just normal masking into a single subtool. This part of the process is quite simple and straightforward, and to be honest with you, is the one area that I find more boring. In fact, clothing is not something that I enjoy while sculpting. For the hard surface elements, like the rings for example, I use standard primitives or either some amendments depending on location. From there, with the help of the ZBrush, I will adjust everything and put the loops and cuts whenever it's needed. Again, I don't try to get all the details in place because I'm aware that this could be done later on texture, but in some cases I felt like they were absolutely necessary. I will be repeating the same operation for the different areas of the character like pants and other belts that Jinx has. Some elements I decided to enhance the fold. The reason why so is because I knew these details could be helpful later on for the concavity map creation, which will help a lot in this type of characters. For the boots, it's quite straightforward. I try to make sure that the boots are divided in all the different areas. You know, for most of the shoes, recreating the physical shape is the best approach rather than sculpting those manually. Also, a lot of these areas are gonna be double-sided, and it's just easier to always start this way. I will be implementing panels early on this stage of the process, using just the same method by masking and extracting every single area. Once I'm happy with those, I could zero mesh with a low value to keep all the elements as simple as possible before starting any detailing process. Something that I enjoy a lot while sculpting this character is due to the fact that there is a lot of simplicity behind it. If you think about it, most of the shapes in Arcane are kinda straightforward and very simple. Like for example, things like the belt, where it's defined by not only by its simplicity, but also by its originality. So it's something that I really enjoy. For the hair, I will just be using some common strands and a common braid brush. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be treating this character as a likeness. So in order to do a likeness, you need to trace. So at this stage, what I'm going to be tracing the original concept on top from what I already sculpted. The cool thing is that the major shapes are already done, so I'm kinda confident that my tracing is going to be accurate. I will be finalizing the skull by focusing in some secondary but also some tertiary details. These details are going to be crucial later on for the concavity map generation. So right now, I don't mind subdividing the sculpt even more so I can get some odd details just in place. I felt that was absolutely necessary just in case my texture process will fail later on. But you know, in Painter I could remove those later on. As a final pass, I just wanted to break even more the silhouette. So just with my move brush, I will just go around and start breaking the silhouette in some elements that I felt that were absolutely necessary. Like for example, the hard surface areas and also the boots. The hair in Arcane is one of these areas that I didn't know how to handle, but I knew that I didn't want to create a hair system. But from what I saw in the show, I noticed that the hair, they seems to be strands. So I'm going to be generating a lot of the strands already in ZBrush. Once I finished the sculpt, I just needed to rename my subtools and prepare them for export. Now, let's start texturing Jinx in Substance Painter. I show you how I set up a smart material for the initial look. Focus only on the diffuse channel for that painted style. Once the base is down, I guide you through my hand painted and all details to make the hair textures really stand out. But before jumping in Painter, I need to jump back into Arcane and analyze what's going on with the lights and shadows. Let's pause the video just for a second. We can clearly see that we have two light sources. One coming from the window and another one coming from the ceiling, or at least is what we assume by checking how the bright areas and shadows are casted on Zbrusha. Alright, let's play it again. Okay, let's just stop it right there. Let's check what's going on. If you see, you can tell that both heads are next to each other and both are perfectly lit. That doesn't make any sense. If we consider from where the lights were coming from, Zbrusha should project her shadows on top of Jinx's face, which should make Jinx look darker on the shot. But rather than look darker, they both look brighter on the face. Guess why? Arcane shadows and highlights are hand painted. On the other hand, even though the shadows and the highlights are painted, they do still use some major light sources to lead the characters in some areas, like for example, the fingers in this case. So much storytelling happening in each frame. It's like every shot is a piece of art. Arcane is so well crafted, artistically speaking, and I could conclude they recreate the scene, lights, and more surprisingly the textures according to the camera shot. Once in Substance Painter, we will select any PBR template, since I won't be using any other channel but the diffuse one. Also, I will disable the UV tile workflow, so I can export each set separately. I will start by baking the cloth elements. We'll extract as many maps as possible. Now I will show you how I will set up the base material for all the elements in this character. The goal here is to get a smart material that gets as close as possible to the concept without any painting, so I can have a better base to start from. I will start by creating a white fill layer with a light generator applied on it. This generator will allow me to get the baked shadows already on the diffuse channel, so I will be playing with it and get it on the frontal area. Here, just use your observation and your artistic skills to find out what is the right parameters. The only thing you need to consider is how high you want the light coming from. So I just adjusted the vertical angle to what I thought it was appropriate in terms of cast shadows. Then, I duplicated the generator, so I could reuse it for the back of the character. This way, I can save time during the process. If I set it to screen mode, it will be added to the previous one. I will repeat the same process for each side of the character. The best way to know if those are working correctly is by isolating each of them and set them to screen mode lately. So at this stage, just make sure that you have your initial generator set up and just play with the blend and try also to play with the source and its intensity and find out what is the right level across each other to try to get the best initial look. You're going to find out that if you keep all of them across with the same intensity, it's not gonna work. So make sure that you play with intensity and try to balance each other. After that, I like to add a blur slope filter. This filter will break the shades from the baked light and will make them look more hand-painted. If you set the blending mode to max and increase the intensity, you can get even better results. The blur slope filter is a filter that I tend to use quite a lot in all my texturing process, not only for Analize. It can give a whole bunch of different subtleties on the texture that can improve quite a lot your characters. So just be mindful and try to use it whenever you feel it's needed. Once I was done with that, I added a curvature generator. I wanted to get at the arcane bevel highlights that are common almost in every piece of cloth and hard surface area. So I just played with the curvature values in order to get those bevel highlights close to the reference. I noticed even though it was working nicely on the top area, some other elements like belts were not. But it's something that I decided to fix later on during the hand-painted process. After that, I duplicated the curvature generator and inverted it. Now it's time to look on the cavity areas and increase the darker value on those. So we'll be playing with values to boost the cavities. On top of this, I generated an ambient occlusion and set it to multiply. This one was kinda obvious, so a small value of ambient occlusion was hardly needed. As you can see, our initial base material is already set up, and it wasn't very difficult to create it. Now it's just a matter of start playing across with different filters and generators that we already created and trying to get a better initial look. I will rename this fill layer so I can instance it or copy it to different elements of the character. Alright, so now it's time to add some color. I will create a new fill layer, but the trick here is to set the layer to don't use any channel. Then I'm going to create a gradient filter with the diffuse channel only enabled on it. This way you can add color to the underneath layer and reuse the information that we already created. After several tests, this was the best way to start Jinx, since it gave me a good starting point before jumping into any painting process. You might not be aware of that, but my favorite feature in Substance Painter is the sample color tool. It has the capability to get colors out of the application. Since I know the textures on the reference are close to the final textures, I will be getting the color information from it as much as possible. You're going to notice that you might to jump back again into the previous material to try to balance those shades. So feel free to just back in and forth and trying to get a better initial look at this stage. Now that I have my smart material created, I just repeated the same operation on each element of the character, divided by materials. So I created a folder for the leather, the fabric, and the metals. This way I can adjust the color gradients separately. Working in groups, it makes life easier, so try to make sure every time you're working in Painter, divide every single element in different subfolders using masks. Alright, so the time is coming now. Now is when we're going to enhance the texture and start the hand-painted process. For it, I used the knife paint brush, which was excellent for this purpose. Make sure that you have your pen sensitivity enabled, since I adjusted the pen to have flow and size dynamic according to the pen pressure. Now it's just a matter to replicate what you see. It's not an easy job, or at least it was not for me since I'm not precisely good on painting, but after a couple of minutes trying to get it right, I think I got the process correctly. Make sure that you observe and you have your right references. Right now is the moment to enjoy it. If you see, I only created one single paint layer. I don't want to be painting across different layers. I want to be sure that at this stage, I try to get as artistic as possible. The same approach I will give it to all bunch of different elements like the pants or, for example, also the boots. So take your time and try to be sure that you consider all the aspects that we discussed before and implement it into your hand-painted process. For the band lines, I use an old trick. I painted each line separately since I noticed the lines were all uneven. After that, in order to get the outer stroke, I used a drop shadow filter. This filter helped me a lot to get it right, so I just needed to focus on the major lines. I love working smart, not necessarily you have to paint every single aspect of the character. Arcane metal style are quite characteristic. In my opinion, they are defined by three major areas. You have the bevels, where we are going to be painting the major highlights. Then you have the reflection, which are gonna be the most saturated areas. And then you have the shadows, which will be also saturated but darker in intensity. So not much blending here happening, but hard transitions mostly. For Jinx skin, I knew it might needed a different setup, so I reused the stylized material that I already created and started just playing with it. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the frontal area of the character, so I made sure that the major baked lights are going to be happening there. I didn't get as close as I wanted to using the smart material, but at least it gave me the skin base. The skin texture is not other than a manual labor. I will need to paint most of it. I felt that the concavities on Jinx's skin texture were sharpened than usual, so I added a sharpened filter to help me on that. Not necessarily it worked on every area, but I could hand paint on top of that later on if it's necessary. With the initial skin tone setup, I could already focus on the major areas like lips, where I will be using a similar approach, using the blur slope filter to help me to get the painting look. Once I was happy with that base, I activated the symmetry and started having fun with the painting process. I'm already more confident with the texturing process at this stage, so eventually it turned out to be less difficult than I thought. The most important here is to keep the face lit, as we learned before, and paint some cast shadows to help the arcane look on the skin. Again, using the sample color tool is an excellent resource here, since I could grab all the color skin information straight from the reference and utilize it on the painting process. Texturing, in my opinion, is not so much about the skills, but about observation. At the end of the day, you have a target and you just commit to it and try to get as close as possible to it. I'm not aiming for perfection since I don't think I probably can get it, but aiming to get the best looking arcane textures I could possibly do. Alright, so it's time to talk about the eyes, the soul of the character. At this point, we know that most of the highlights are painted on Arcane, and eyes are no exception. I observed that most of the shots have this characteristic highlight double pattern, so I will commit to that. Also, if you notice, the upper eyelid casts shadows is already projected into the texture. Finally, one area that caught my attention was the corneal limbus. The strokes were completely uneven, and in some cases they looked like straight lines. Eyes were the easy area to work on this character, since it has less strong elements on it, so I just focused on what we saw before. For my Jinx version, I wanted to get the berserker look, so strong purple eyes and eye mascara will just do the job. I just tried to replicate what I see on the reference right now. Alright, our model is ready and it's time to jump into Unreal Engine. I've been diving deep into the Arcane art style for a while, even trying to create my own custom cel shader to capture the style, but after days testing it, I hit a wall. Nothing seemed to match. So I decided to take a step back and really analyze the show. And then is what I got a revelation. By checking some of the Arcane shots frame by frame, I realized most of the cast shadows are hand-painted. I knew about the ambient occlusion, but I didn't know about the cast shadows. Arcane doesn't use global illumination at all. So I went back to Unreal, disabled global illumination, and suddenly everything clicked. All it took was a standard PBR shader with a simple diffuse and no global illumination. I couldn't believe how easy the setup actually was. So I'm going to show you how I created my scene in Unreal Engine. First, I like to invert the middle mouse button so I can navigate inside Unreal Engine the same way that I do in Maya. Now it's time to load my FBX mesh. And just be sure that you turn on combine mesh, so you want single static mesh during the import process. After that, I created a new folder for the textures, and dragged just the diffuse textures and also the emissive textures for the eyes. Since all the base materials are already created, I'm just going to hook the new textures into the diffuse input. Now the next stage, I'm going to delete everything that is coming in the scene and create an empty scene. I'm going to load a DOM mesh and grab the GitMesh that we just set up. I'm going to create some viewpoint lights and trying to recreate a nice neutral light in order to validate the shader and the textures better. I noticed that the lens flare was pretty obvious here, so I managed to remove it just by decreasing the intensity on it. Also, it's time to add some background color. For the look depth scene, I created a new camera so I can focus on the portrait. This way I'm able to judge the face better since it's the most important area and aspect of this character. Right now I need to set up my focus settings as well in the camera by using a focus plane, but I have a better trick for it. I like to use what I call focus sphere. Now I'm going to be creating a sphere and placing in between the eyes of my character. I like to rename it to something more obvious. After that, inside the camera settings, I will just need to set it up to tracking mode and then select my focus sphere. This way, I can move the camera around and my characters will be always on focus. Inside the post-process volume, I like to be playing with exposure compensation and also with the film settings. This will help quite a lot to get a better film look. For the hair, I'm going to be loading a freeze and opacity textures. From here, I'm going to set up the hair shader. First, I'm going to set up an initial color, and then with the multiply node, we'll combine it with the opacity mask. The next stage is control the level of repetition, so I can control how much the hair is visible. This can be achieved by creating a coordinate node and hook it straight to the UV input from the texture sample. Then it's as simple as create a U and V parameters and play with those depending on the amount of hair you want them to be repeated according to the UV coordinates. This part of the process took me a couple of days to take it correctly. Creating hair is not specifically easy, especially when it comes to arcane hair, which is very complex and I'm sure is not necessarily the right approach. But in any scenario, the overall look that I was getting little by little was getting there. Now it's time to start moving with different parameters like for example the specular and also the roughness. But something that I noticed with arcane characters is that the hair has a certain level of metallicity. So the metal parameter is something that I'm also going to be playing quite a lot at this stage. And I will be pretty much experimenting with it and trying to get an overall look that is close as possible to the show. Once I had my metallicity already working on the shader and everything better set up, I noticed that the shadows were not casting nicely. But if I disable global illumination on my scene, everything started working way better. You can do this inside the project settings or either in the post-process volume. Alright, confession time. I used to struggle endlessly with creating full body rigs. I needed a rig that I could work in Unreal and easy to set up. So after looking online, I discovered AccuRig and it changed everything. With AccuRig, you can generate a full body rigs in seconds. It saves so much time and headache, letting me jump right into the fun part of the character creation. So I'm going to show you how it works and why it's a game changer. So the process in AccuRig couldn't be more simple. We just need to load our FBX mesh. Then just select Force Symmetry if you happen to have a symmetrical character like this case. Select the body rig and it just takes a few seconds to generate initial joints. The software is smart enough to understand where the joint position should be. Same happens with the fingers. It will automatically understand which is the best location, but I will recommend you, at least for the fingers, consider improving its location. The process will be finalized just by checking animation. All this process didn't take me longer than 2 minutes, and I already have Jinx rigged and skinned. And here is one of the benefits of using Actor Core, is that it has a free library so you can check every single animation on top of your character and fix the rig if it's necessary. As a tip, if you jump into Revolution website, you will find a bunch of free animations. I'm going to be using the city animation for the still frame I'm going after. After that, I needed to import the generated rig into Maya and set up the joint chain to recreate the skeleton for the braids area. Now it's time to jump into Unreal Engine and set up the control rig. Make sure that under your plugins, you enable control rig and restart Unreal. I'm going to create a new folder just for the rig elements and import the new rigged mesh. Create a control rig and select the modular rig option. Inside the modular rig, we need to load the rigged mesh by selecting Import Hierarchy and load our Jinx rig. It's called modular rig because you can create the different connections that way. Once you drag the modular spine into the empty socket, you're going to notice new sockets will show up. These sockets are going to be the input for the next modular stages. It's kinda obvious at this stage, but I will be dragging and dropping the modular neck. Also their shoulders, both right side and left side. The hand sockets are renamed to arms for some reason, so we will be dropping the arm on both sides of the character. Let's repeat the process with the right leg, the left leg, and finally the feet. For some reason during this setup, Jinx's knees were twisting, and it's something that I never managed to get rid of. To be fair, it didn't really bother me at this stage, but if you happen to know how to fix it, just let me know in the comments. Once you are finished with the initial setup, if you load your mesh in the sequencer, now you can load the control rig and pose your character. This was an excellent start for the rig, but still is incomplete. We will finalize it later on. Alright, so now it's time to go and import the first animation. In this case, I'm going to be loading the sitting animation, the one that we exported from Actor Core. Now, don't be alarmed. For some reason, Unreal Engine always gives you these false alarms. You can omit those. Something that bothered me was the braid skinning. They were constantly giving me issues and I had the feeling that I had something to do during the import process. Anyway, it's something that I never managed to figure out. I had to live with it, I guess. Now inside the sequencer, I will load my character and my new animation. After that, it's pretty simple. I'm going to look for a frame that fits the initial pose of the character. But you know, this skinning issue was bothering me a lot. So I enabled the mesh editing tools inside Unreal Engine and trying to fix it inside. You know, it seems to work somewhat correctly from the very beginning, but guess what? As a lot of these plugins in Unreal, they just don't work correctly. So it just happened to have several crashes during the process. Can't wait till it works perfectly. I decided to give up and fix the skinning problems inside Maya. Still, it was very tedious to go through this part of the process because I needed to force every single new pose. So now with the hair fixed, it's time to add the new sockets for every joint of the braids. I would recommend you to go one by one, because during this process I also have a lot of crashes, and I have to repeat this several times. So what I would recommend you, create one socket per joint and then just place it to the right group of the chain. In this case for the braids, we're going to place them under the neck group. Unreal is smart enough to understand if it's left or right side, and even will color code it accordingly. Once you have it already renamed and set it up, just jump into the control rig and change the shape to something that is easier to play with later on. At this stage I will just rotate the control rig and make sure that it makes more sense. After that, I'm going to compile and check on my sequencer. The new control rig will show up and you can even start animating it. I will repeat the same operation for every single joint, and again, you need to compile for every single joint too, so be sure that you take this part of the process very cautious. Let's avoid some crashes. For the eyes, I'm going to do the same thing. Once the sockets are created, I will be just loading the new controls for every different eye. Once I have both controls created, I just need to make sure that the eye section belongs to the neck group. Now it's as simple as change the control shape and place it correctly before we compile it again. Now I have both eye controls inside the sequencer, so we can rotate the eyes accordingly. I'm already thinking about how I want to pose Jinx. To be honest, I didn't know how I wanted to pose. I just knew that I want her to be relaxed somewhat. So I will spend some time just playing with my controls and posing her. I noticed while posing her, some shadows were not working right. But by turning off contact shadow length in world space for some lights, it did fix the problem. So it's so fascinating how Unreal Engine has all these small issues that are very difficult to figure it out. Alright, time to have the final camera configured. I feel like with the new chair element the composition was looking better, so I enabled my rules inside the viewer and start playing with the composition and lighting. This way it will be easier to create the final shot. Just remember, you are working for the camera, so pin the camera and place everything according to it. Okay, so for the final section, I'm going to breaking down this shot. But before jumping into the animation, the first thing that I need to do is enable simulations on the braids. So we're going to do so. If you load your physical asset, you will notice that it has by default several capsule plays. In my case there were some missing, so I add a capsule shape for each joint that I felt was necessary. After that, I will be orienting and also reshaping each capsule to make sure that wraps the mesh better. The most important thing here is that they don't intersect by default with a collider, otherwise you can have very strange results. Now if you right click on them and enable simulations, you're going to notice that they're going to behave initially as a ragdoll. To avoid that, we need to enable constraints in each joint. So select the joint and enable constraint. From there, you will get a pop-up menu, so I need to select the previous joint from the chain. You need to repeat the same operation for every single joint and create each constraint independently. If I hit simulation, we're going to see that it already behaves better. But it doesn't finish there. Now we need to set up the constraint properties. For the constraint properties, we're going to set our angular drive mode to twist and swing, and turn and swing. On the strength value, we're going to set up a high one. Now when we simulate, we have a better behavior. It won't be perfect, but at least it worked enough for a shot. For the frontal hair, I'm going to repeat exactly the same operations. Now all the hair is simulated, and for the purpose possible, we'll handle it correctly. It's time to select our animation. I'm going to export the hero strat from Actor Core into Unreal Engine, but I had a problem. When I loaded into Unreal Engine, the character was not in place but moving forward. In order to fix that, I need to bake the animation so I can access the different frames. I just need to search for the root joint and select all the frames that belong to the Y location. If I hit delete, then automatically my character will stay in place. By staying stationary, the simulations will work better, and I will be able to make the cameras and the light easier, since I will need to animate them. For the environment, I'm going to be using this free asset that I found in Fab. Once I load it, I just need to place the character in. I decided to purchase fire assets from Fab 2 so they could enhance Jinx's presence on the shot. I think the fire was doing a great job and was pretty easy to set up. From there, it's time to play with the camera exposition, and I already thinking on how I want to compose these shots. I noticed that the fire was not emitting enough light, so I needed to create separate color light sources to be able to lead Jinx better. Light on a scene is very crucial because it's going to already give a mood to the whole scene. For the fifth shot, I set up a second camera and deleted whichever frame was not necessary. I think as a character artist, it's always very pleased when you see your own characters animated, and this way you don't have to wait for a rigger or animator to do it for you. Now you can do it yourself just by using the process that I'm just showing you. Inside the sequencer, I loaded both cameras and started to work on my full sequence. But I noticed that my working animation was stopping on frame 100. To be able to fix that, we need to bake the sequence animation again and export the new sequence inside the sequencer and load it into our character. Once we play the animation, if we right click on it and select post infinity cycles, we can extend it forever. So now the character will be always animated no matter what stage of the sequence we're at. Alright, let's load new assets, so make sure you have the Fab plugin enabled. Now it's time to load all bunch of different assets that can enhance both camera shots. The good thing is that Fab is a marketplace with all bunch of free elements, so you just go and select whatever fits your needs. I'm aware that aesthetics are not arcane aesthetics, but I didn't really care much at this stage because all these elements were going just to be blurred on the background. Once I had both cameras placed correctly and framed them, I will spend next time just placing these elements independently and making sure that they look correct in every single camera shot. Exporting the movie is pretty simple. Inside the sequencer, just hit Movie Render Queue. I'm going to turn off JPEG and enable PNG. On the settings, I'm turning also high resolution. After that, just going to save the preset just in case I'm going to be reusing that later on. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this breakdown helpful and maybe you even got inspired to dive into the Arcane art style yourself. I hope you enjoyed the video or learned something new. Please give it a thumbs up or consider subscribing for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So, for example, what part of the process do you find more difficult or what would you like to know more about? Until the next time, keep creating and I'll see you in the next video.